Hi, everybody. As you probably already know, my name is Yahav. If this is the first episode you're listening to, nice to meet you. And I was born and raised as an Israeli and as a Zionist. During the past few years, I've gone through the process of questioning the narrative I grew up with regarding this land we live in and the people living on it. This podcast is about voices of the disillusioned. Each episode is a one-on-one heartfelt conversation with an activist who supports the Palestinian struggle, telling the story of the journey that led them to see through what they were taught. Each of these people have their own unique path that I believe anyone can learn from, whether you're a Palestinian or a Jew living here or abroad, or just anyone who feels strongly about this subject. I hope you learn as much as I learned from them about how to build a better future for all people between the river and the sea. Becca Strober is a political strategist and educator. They are a co-founder of Freedom School, a former senior director at Breaking the Silence, and current chairperson of the board of the Jewish Palestinian educational organization, Sadaka Reut. They run the Instagram page and podcast Becca Explains the Occupation, which aims to deepen the understanding of the actions and policies in the Palestinian occupied territories and Israel in both Hebrew and English. They believe that in a time of widespread disinformation, focusing on changing the system rather than on buzzwords is necessary so that we can push for equality and a just future for Palestinians and Israelis. Welcome, Becca.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. I'm so excited to have you because I kind of see you in all these different channels of activism that I've just described and many more. But I think maybe we'll start by talking a little about the Instagram page, Becca Explains the Occupation, because I feel like that's so impactful because you're really able to break down all the so complicated, bureaucratic, depressing aspects of the occupation. I mean, not that anything about the occupation isn't depressing, but you take all this horrible stuff and you kind of break it down to how it works, what's happening, where, why, and when. And it's really important because a lot of people don't understand what's going on and they're very confused. So how did you start doing this?
So first I want to say that I think a lot of what I hear people say is, oh, it's complicated. The conflict is complicated. The occupation is complicated. And there's no question that the system is complex, which is why it works so well. But that's not the same as complicated. And when you break it down and you see the inequality and you see the injustice, and when you stand and watch someone's house being destroyed by the military because they can't get the ability to build their house in the West Bank, and then you see their house being destroyed in front of your eyes, it's really actually not complicated. And that was one of the things that I wanted to bring to the conversation. October 7th really made me shut down. And I think that was very true for most Israelis who had been very vocal up until that point. For me, October 7th wasn't some huge turning point. It was a shock. It shocked my system. It didn't necessarily completely surprise me. There was a lot that was going on in the months before October 7th and a huge escalation that I'd seen with my own eyes over the past decade, that it was really clear that we were headed towards an immense amount of violence and that violence was also going to affect Israelis and not exclusively Palestinians or not even just principally Palestinians. But it's still, October 7th still quieted me. And one of the things I found was that on Instagram in the weeks after October 7th, people were sharing a lot of disinformation. And I had already been working in political education at this point for a little over a decade. And once upon a time, I would have kind of engaged people. And after October 7th, I felt like I couldn't do that. I was, first of all, afraid. I was afraid of being harassed. I was afraid of being put in jail. I was afraid for my physical safety, for that of my partners. We also live in a really small kind of village outside of Tel Aviv. People don't necessarily know what we do, and it felt like a really scary time to be exposed. And so I didn't answer people. And I also just felt like people people were scared, people were fearful, people were angry. There was a lot of emotions. And if there's one thing I've learned over the years doing education, it's that you can't answer emotion with information. That's not the right educational tool to use at the moment. And at the same time, I felt like there was this growing vacuum. Like, as you can tell from my accent, obviously I'm also American. I was raised in Philadelphia, but to a family who's partially from Jerusalem, and I've been in Israel since I was 18, and I speak Hebrew fluently, and I speak English fluently, and being online in those two conversations in those two languages, there was no points of connection. Literally none. That's what I felt. And I wanted to create those points of connection. And the place where I really felt that I had to finally speak out more generally was whenever the hostage deal happened and the exchange deal happened, maybe, 5 weeks into the war, something like that. There was this whole entire campaign in the Hasbara world that was like, they're releasing hostages, we're releasing terrorists, right? Mm-hmm. Because it was an exchange. And that made me really, really, really mad, both because it was a clear campaign to not go through with the deal. And I felt that Israel had abandoned its own citizens. People always talk about, like, Israel has the right to defend itself. Like, no, Israel, like any state, has a requirement to protect its own citizens, and it was failing to do that over and over and over again. And of course, I was very much pro a deal, and so that really angered me. But also knowing that most of the Palestinians who are going to be released are actually Palestinians who are under the age of 18 years old, who were unjustly arrested and definitely were unjustly sitting in jail. Meaning either many of them hadn't even gone through trial, many of them are under administrative detention and won't ever go through trial. And those who did go through trial, there's close to a 99% conviction rate. And Palestinians also are almost never granted bail. There's at most a 5% granting of bail for Palestinians who are in the military system. And
you
so
mean like detained by the military system?
Who are detained by the military system. So it doesn't make sense. Like, basically, if Palestinians plead guilty, they'll sit in jail less time, overwhelmingly. And so often lawyers of Palestinian detainees will recommend that they plead guilty, even though that doesn't actually mean that they did whatever the army has arrested them for, right? And even if they did, even if a Palestinian in Hebron, in the middle of Hebron, threw a rock on the Israeli military, these like huge military jeeps, and a Palestinian is throwing a rock on them, that doesn't make them a terrorist. But the reality is that most of the Palestinians who I know who were arrested as children, and I'm talking about Palestinian children who I knew when they were children, arrested at that moment, I've seen it in front of my eyes, were arrested for participating in nonviolent protest, were arrested for facilitating younger kids going to school in the South Hebron Hills, were arrested for existing near a settlement. And they weren't, these aren't reasons to arrest children. These aren't reasons to arrest 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds and 18-year-olds. It's not a reason to arrest anyone, but definitely children. And so I started on my own Instagram, on my personal Instagram, in Hebrew and in English, breaking down how the military system actually works when it comes to detainment, imprisonment, and charge.
Oh, just to explain the whole hostage deal.
Just to explain the hostage deal.
Oh, okay.
It just started out with me being like, I basically wanted to respond to all of my friends in their DMs who were sharing like, we're releasing terrorists that were really, for the most part, not. I think there were 3 women out of 100 and something people who were released who are Palestinian who participated in violence against civilians, like who you could put a label of real criminal or terror activity on, and everyone else, no, right? And also those 3 women also didn't get a fair trial because there is no checks and balances in the military system. So I just wanted to explain that. And so I made a bunch of stories using just B'Tselem and I think Yesh Din and all these different Israeli human rights organizations and some Palestinian human rights organizations. And a lot of people were tagging it, were kind of taking the story and posting it on their own stories and tagging me. And so then I did a few more about a few other issues, like water getting into Gaza and gas getting into Gaza. And people basically asked me to open up my Instagram and keep doing it, and I didn't want to. So my friend was like, well, you should just make a separate Instagram and call it Becca Explains Stuff. So that's what I did, but I'm obviously not explaining general stuff. I'm explaining the occupation, and that's how Becca Explains the Occupation was born. And the real, purpose of it is to break down how the military system functions, break down what often looks like a really complex system, so that people can understand it, so that we can fight it. I think there's a lot of kind of like buzz online of making the situation special. Talking about Israelis as being some sort of special evil, or the occupation being some sort of special evil. And I don't think that's true. I think this is exactly what a system looks like when it's built to be zero-sum, and when one state has all of the power over two people, but is only representing one of those people. This is exactly where we're going to come to. And if you were to take this, more or less exact situation and put it on another two people, or put it in a different time zone, or put it in a different, timeline, you would more or less get the same outcomes. And therefore, what we need to do is fight back, fight the system. And in order to do that, we actually need to understand how the system's working. And for as much as people have gotten... On the Israeli side, people don't want to talk about it. The indoctrination is so overwhelming. The echo chamber is so loud. But also, it was important for me to do it in English because I did want to focus the conversation in on the reality that there is a whole entire system of indoctrination and a whole entire system of inequality that is making it so we participate, and that is making it so that the system can succeed. And therefore, we need to break down the system. It has pillars. There are pillars holding up the system, and we need to knock the pillars down. We need to break the pillars down. And so that's what I kind of started doing with this Instagram. It's been a little bit over a year now, like a year and a month. And when a topic comes up that interests me, may it be something that I think is important for people to understand in order to understand the basics of the occupation, or something that's in the media that I think is not getting necessarily all of the context that it needs, then I'll try and do a post or a video about it to break down how this actually functions, how the system functions.
Amazing. I have to say, as someone who is pretty versed in the human rights organization sphere, I feel that it's like going into a rabbit hole. If you don't really know too much about it, you don't know where to even begin. It's just so much, so overwhelming. And so it's really helpful to have someone kind of break it down for you in a simple and accessible way. And then kind of, from there you have your resources, like you reference to whoever researched and did the work. And then if you want to keep learning about it, you can go there. But you need someone to kind of like point you in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also something I found a lot. Like most of the work I do outside of Instagram or offline is with Israelis, and especially a lot of Israeli educators and educational systems. People have no idea where to look. Of course, in Israel itself, we also have this added issue where human rights organizations are considered to be traitors. They're, considered to be untrustworthy. And so people aren't going to go into B'Tselem's website. They're not going to go, right? They're not going to go into Breaking the Silence's website to look up information. And then other organizations like Peace Now, people don't necessarily know that they do a settlement watch, right? And so it's a combination of this information, you have, the information's not very accessible. And the information that does exist, that is somewhat accessible, is considered to be given by untrustworthy organizations. And also, and this is no fault of human rights organizations because it's, most of my work relies on this sphere, but putting out a human rights organization like report is so unsexy. Even if someone knows.
It's so true.
Even if someone knows kind of where to look, it's really boring.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to tell it like a story.
Exactly.
And a lot of times, and obviously journalists do this to an extent, but I find also it's really helpful if you're talking about, for example, settler violence, being able to put it all together and show the narrative when you're using the information from a bunch of different organizations, from Palestinian perspective, from Palestinian organizations, from different Israeli organizations that are all kind of covering a piece of it. you can show a whole entire story as to how it's going. And most organization tends to hyper-focus on what they're doing, which makes sense.
Yeah, it's like a zoom in and you're basically zooming out.
Right. And I'm trying to zoom out and tell a story of how this all functions and what are the results of it. Right. And also, why is it preventing us from moving to a more just reality? And yeah, so I think it's like really, really important. And it's also really important for me to have sources because I want people to actually go and look further. And if they want to be able to research more. And in Hebrew, it's amazing how hard it is to get good sources. There's human rights organizations, but when you look in English, you obviously have to be able to double check and know which resources are valuable and which ones are trustworthy. And, you know, that's something that you get from kind of being in this world for so long. But it exists. You can read a lot about the occupation in English.
Oh, yeah.
And in Hebrew, you can't. And one of the things I get a lot on my Instagram, probably one of the biggest pushbacks I get from people abroad, is there's no way Israelis don't know. There's no way Israelis don't know about the occupation. Or I'll see people say like, you know, if I was Israeli, I would never join the army. If I was Israeli, I wouldn't have gone to Nova because I wouldn't dance outside of an open air prison. And it just makes me think like, wow, people really don't appreciate how well indoctrination works and how hard it is to find information in Hebrew. And
even if it exists,
it's also like, you know, I think like a really great example is yesterday I read that the Ministry of Education again barred the Bereaved Families Forum.
Yeah.
From entering Israeli schools. And Bereaved Family Forum is basically a forum of Palestinian and Israeli families who all lost people due to the occupation and conflict. And they come and tell their personal stories. As I would say, as far as like political organizations go, they're much more to the personal side than political, as in they're not trying to necessarily... obviously they want to end the occupation, but they're not doing like policy work on it. They're really trying to come from a human place and tell personal stories and talk about why the occupation and war is bad for both sides. Meaning it's really hard, I think, to disagree on any level with the work that they're doing. And yet the Ministry of Education now for, I think the second time at this point, it might be the third time, has said that they're not allowed to go into schools. And the reasoning that they gave was things like it harms the like overall mission of the army and it harms people's belief in the mission of the army.
Yeah, I read that.
Right? And it's just like that. I mean, what could be more indoctrinating than that? Like, oh, we can't hear how Palestinians or even Israelis have been harmed by the structural violence because it makes us not want to continue that structural violence. And so now to expect is every single Israeli to just go out and find that information on their own and want to find it out, right? Our echo chamber is so loud. It's so strong. And we believe it, right? Like we're really indoctrinated into believing it.
You also don't see anything else.
Nothing.
You literally do not see the claims and the arguments that are supposed to counter that.
Right.
That's the thing. People are yelling out loud on the top of their lungs and the genocide and the war and the occupation and apartheid. But the people in the echo chambers aren't hearing that.
Right. They're not hearing it. And when they are hearing it, it's clearly an anti-Semitic claim, right? Yeah. It's either anti-Semitic or you're traitors or it's because of Europe, who of course is anti-Semitic, or it's because of Hamas, who like...
all these different excuses.
Right.
You'll maybe see, the encampments in the universities in the US, but you'll only see it through the lens of the Israeli media.
Right.
Which will be framing it as a very specific thing.
Right. And so there's really no space to talk about anything. And I wanted to break that down. I mean, that's what I do on a daily basis offline. And so I wanted to be able to kind of come in and add that on to the sphere of Instagram, because let's be honest, that's where a lot of conversation is happening these days, right? It's happening on Instagram, it's happening on Twitter, it's happening on TikTok. And so we need to be there too. And it's been kind of like a crazy year. I'm like not a social media person. So becoming a social media person has been a really, really wild change in my life. But it's been so far, I think, an interesting project. And after a year of explaining how things function, and I'm probably going to continue doing that, but I also feel much, much more motivated at this moment to think about how the hell do we get out of this situation?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think we all know, even Israelis, I don't have to, when I take Israelis on like tours now to Hebron, which I did up until about a month ago, for the last 7 years, it used to be so hard to convince like young Israelis why this is bad for us. Like, why is apartheid bad for us?
Because they see it in Hebron on the other side of the wall, far away from where they live, and why should they care?
Yeah, and I also think that the whole entire state, it's built on this premise of zero sum. We can be safe or Palestinians can be safe. And so if Palestinians being unsafe makes us safe,
then why would we want
anything else? We're safe.
Yeah.
Right? And I think there's been a change. I think that Israelis who are in their 30s and 40s, those of us who remember the Second Intifada,
mm-hmm.
as an actual memory that like we experienced, is very different than the generation who remembers the Second Intifada as a myth. Meaning Israelis who today are about to enlist in the army, they don't remember the Second Intifada. Some of them were born towards the end of the Second Intifada or even slightly after it, right? Yeah, I mean, the Intifada ended at like the end of 2003, and those enlisting in the army now probably 2006, 2007 were born, something like that. And so they really were born and raised into this reality in which the way that the system has worked is we've managed to put a daily level of violence on Palestinians fairly successfully up to the point where it wouldn't be felt on Israelis.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, which is the inherent zero sum.
Yeah.
Of course, that completely ended on October 7th. I think it never really existed also. I mean, if you're paying attention. Yeah. But not only just was it an illusion, like it was an illusion, but also if you were living in Sderot in the past 20 years, then it was bullshit. It wasn't just an illusion, it was bullshit. But there was this narrative that it was working, that we didn't have to think about it and we could be totally passive.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, you bring 18-year-olds to Hebron and it's not even like, it used to be, oh, security, security, security. And now it's just like, why should we care? Right? That's where 18-year-olds were at before October 7th. After October 7th, now you don't have 18-year-olds that ask, why should we care? They don't necessarily agree with me. A lot of them think that the result should be ethnic cleansing, but they do understand why we need to care.
Yeah.
Right? And that's, to an extent, I think, a major change in how young people are thinking about the reality.
Yeah. We'll get back later on to what else you've been doing in the past decade, but I want to go back a few steps to where you're from, where your family's from. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Philadelphia, but my family is from, amongst other places, is from Jerusalem. Part of my family is from Jerusalem. And the part of my family that's from Jerusalem came to Jerusalem in 1809. And we really see ourselves as Jerusalemites. I grew up with a Jerusalem identity in Philadelphia. And my family was not part of the Zionist movement for decades. But as the founding of the state got closer, became part of the Etzel and the Lehi, kind of the more revisionist Zionist movement and the violence that came with it. And I really grew up on stories of like heroic stories of my family helping to like, you know, plant bombs against the British. And that was something that I was proud of, meaning it was in no way kind of like these were positive stories. They were in no way stories with any sort of negative aspects to them. And what I really took from that was we need to do everything we can to make sure that the Jewish people can be safe in the land of Israel. I didn't necessarily grow up in the same way that I think others did, with this very strong, specific Zionist education. I think a lot of my Zionist education was much more passive. I think that when it comes to Jerusalem, the Jerusalem identity is really, really strong. And so that's always a place where I felt incredible connection to. But at the same time, you know, my family would talk about like Jabotinsky. And I wasn't really necessarily connecting the dots, if I'm being honest, when I was growing up. But in Philadelphia, I went to a progressive synagogue in Philadelphia. It was Reform, My dad was the president of the synagogue for a while. And I look back on it and I think it's amazing that I grew up in this fairly progressive, fairly liberal community, that would talk about things like the two-state solution. And it was only when I was 17 and I was in Israel on the reform movement's semester abroad, and I was living near Jerusalem, that was the first time I actually saw a map that carved out the West Bank in Gaza. And I felt a deep sense of loss and sadness. And that was the first time that I had any clue as to what the two potential states that people talk about when they talk about the two-state solution was referring to. And I look back on that and I think, wow, we actually had no political education, right? Meaning this community that sees itself as progressive, as believing in peace, as in their mind believing in the two-state solution, were actually mainly doing it in order to be able to feel good or to stop themselves from thinking critically about what actually needs to happen. Because if they actually ideologically wanted the two-state solution, then by age 17, as someone who was a real product of the reform movement, who had grown up in the movement, who had gone to all the classes and done all the work and spent time in my synagogue, I would have known where the West Bank was. And I didn't, right? But that aside, when I was in Israel, during that same semester, I was 17, it was 2006. The disengagement was happening. It had just happened from Gaza, but I had no idea what it was. Really?
Let's just give a little bit of background. There were Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip, and in 2005, there was a decision by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon to disengage, meaning to evacuate all the settlements out of the Gaza Strip, and that was executed in that summer.
And to pull out Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
And because of that, a lot of Israelis today will say,
but we left Gaza. What do they want?
Right, which of course isn't true. Today I know we had an immense amount of control over the Gaza Strip even after we left. But for example, when I was here in 2006, you could still see people with the orange ribbons, which was the ribbons that people in the settlement movement would put on their clothes or on their backpacks.
Or on their cars.
On their cars to say that they were anti-disengagement. And I was kind of learning about those things when I was here in Jerusalem for a semester, and I really didn't have any political awareness as to what I thought or to what was going on.
You couldn't situate all these different movements or ideas in certain kind of political spheres.
Absolutely not.
You didn't understand that the disengagement from Gaza was something that the settlement movement would be against because they're for expanding the settlements wherever possible.
Yeah, I couldn't put it into so many words. I knew to an extent that I was against settlements, but could I tell you what settlements really meant, in a deep sense? Absolutely not. In fact, as a birthday present, my dad gave me this movie about, it's an Israeli movie. I have no idea what it's called, but I remember it very well, where they were taking out, it was right before the disengagement of Gaza, of Gush Katif, which is the settlements that were in Gaza. And the whole entire movie was about the disengagement. And then the other part of the movie was about this group of settlers who wanted to blow up
Al-Aqsa Mosque?
Al-Aqsa Mosque from below.
Oh, המחתרת היהודית.
Yeah. And I watched that whole entire movie and I had no idea what it was about. I watched it multiple times when I was trying to perfect my Hebrew. And I had no idea. Every single time I watched it when I was a teenager, I had no clue what was actually going on there. I should really watch it again, from the eyes and knowledge and perspective that I have now. But it really just shows how much I didn't know. What I did know was that my cousins were either joining the army or kind of mid-service, and I would go and I would do Shabbat dinners with them when I was here.
These were the family that stayed here.
This was the family that stayed here.
Not left for the U.S.
Yeah. My grandmother was one of 12 children. She was the youngest of 12 children. And the Rivlin family, my family is the Rivlin family, and the family is a very big family. But even just my small branch, my dad has over 40-something first cousins. Oh, wow. We've lost track.
So a lot of the ones that were already here had stayed, and some left.
A few left.
And you were from the branch that left.
I was from the branch that left, yeah. My grandmother basically was kicked out in the mid-1940s because my family was very active in the Etzel and the Lehi, and I think in general were worried about her being overly involved. I don't think they were worried about her being involved in politics, but I think they were worried about her being in what was clearly a kind of politically dangerous situation. And it was very clear that war was coming. And I've heard two stories, and I don't know which is correct, but one is that they sent her to live with her sister in New York when she was dating a British soldier, because she was dating a British soldier. And the other one was because she was dating a soldier from the Haganah, which was just like one of the less violent, but still uber violent pre-state militias, because they were in the Lehi and they were like, the Haganah is weak. And so they like sent her to live with her sister in New York.
That's funny.
And I think that's the real version. So the vast majority of those 12 siblings stayed in Israel, and the former president of Israel, Ruby Rivlin, is my dad's first cousin. Like his mom and my grandmother were sisters. Uh-huh. In fact, his mom like raised my grandmother. She was the oldest sister and my grandmother was the youngest sister. Uh-huh. And so when I was here in 2006, a lot of those cousins, who I guess for the most part are my second cousins, were enlisting in the army or were in the army. You know, I would see them on Shabbat. They would come in their like military uniform, like in their Aleph, like in their nice version. And I felt really inspired by that. And my feeling was, you know, I want to strengthen my connection with Jerusalem. I want to strengthen my connection with my family. And I think that going to university or going to college seemed like such an individual decision, like an individualist decision. And I was looking for a more collective life and answer. And that brought me to move to Israel when I was 18. And it seemed like a totally natural thing to do. Like so much of my family is here. My cousins are here. My family's from here. Obviously, if you go back far enough, they're from other places besides Jerusalem. But my cousins, I think some of my younger cousins are like, I don't know, 13th or 14th generation Jerusalemite. And I really wanted to be a part of that. And also the idea of all the stories I were raised with of like, you know, this is the homeland of the Jewish people. And we have to make sure that it's always going to be here for us. You know, there's that like poem about being handed Israel on a silver platter. Mm-hmm. That I like have cried reading that poem.
Oh, wow.
Like in high school. If you like look through my journals in high school, it's me like doodling like En li eretz acheret, like I have no other land. I mean, and I really felt like, who am I to get this on a silver platter when my family has worked so hard to be here? And so I moved to Israel and I joined the army. And between the years of 2008 and 2010, I served as a shooting instructor for infantry soldiers. Mm-hmm. And people always ask me about, like, what was your watershed moment when you realized that the occupation was unjust? And I didn't have a watershed moment. I had a lot of moments. I think that one of the moments that stuck with me the most was when I was in the shooting range. So I'd be teaching infantry soldiers, mainly infantry soldiers who hadn't yet done anything. Like they were early on in their service, they were still in training. And we would wear these shirts where we would have, in the military, you have like A uniforms and B uniforms are from cotton. But we only had to wear the pants, and then we could wear shirts. But the shirts weren't even given to us by the military. There were some that were given to us by our unit, but also you could just go print shirts out in this like random shirt store in South Tel Aviv. And then like different instructors would pass it down from one to the other. And so the shirts that I was wearing in the shooting range, teaching infantry soldiers how to shoot, said things like 1 shot, 1 kill. And then they would have like a target on it. And in the target, there would be usually a man falling. It was clear that like he had just been shot. And that's what we would wear when we would teach soldiers how to shoot. There were other ones I remember that said, every breath you take, every move you make, I'll be watching you. And I remember feeling so cool wearing these shirts. And then you teach soldiers how to shoot. And you always say fire, right? So that they release a bullet. And when you say fire many, many times a day, it gets really boring. And so we would start coming up with things that weren't fire, right? So first we would come up with names of like terrorists, right? Like Osama bin Laden. Like that's the type of name that we would say. But pretty quickly you run out of names because what do we actually know? And then I remember saying like Arafat, and I remember saying Abbas. And absolutely there were times, both me and other people in the shooting range, where we would just say Arab. And I remember one time, I didn't say Arab, but I went through the whole list and I got to Abbas. And then I ran out of ideas. And then I said Mickey Mouse. And the soldier didn't shoot. He stopped and he turned around to me and he said, "You want to kill Mickey Mouse?" And I was like, oh, damn, do I want to kill Abbas? And for me, that was one of those moments where he didn't give a shit about that, right? Like he didn't care about all the other names I had said up until that moment. And I don't think anyone ever turned around for anything else. But all of a sudden, Mickey Mouse is this like clearly innocent character. And he's like, "Do you want to kill Mickey Mouse?" And it really made me start thinking about the dehumanization that we did in the shooting ranges. And that was met as my service went on with also spending time in the West Bank. And when you spend time in the West Bank, you realize that the people in between the scopes of your guns are not some foreign army, right? They're not even really, like, for the most part, Hamas, or like, they're not even militants. They're civilians. The vast majority are civilians. And the vast majority of what we do as soldiers in the West Bank is police.
Police civilians.
Police civilians, yeah.
But as a military.
A
foreign military.
As a foreign military. And it's amazing because when you're in the shooting ranges, you teach soldiers how to take over a hill in Syria, which, to be fair, is exactly what Israel is doing right now.
Yeah.
But during my service, none of that happened. When I joined the army, I was in basic training when there was the war with Gaza in like the winter of 2008, 2009. And then the rest of my service, up until this October, basically, there was barely anyone that I had trained that stepped outside of the river to the sea, right? Of soldiers, meaning the vast majority of what soldiers were doing, who I trained, was then after learning how to take over a hill in Syria or learn how to, to save a hostage, actually. That's like if people are being dragged away, that was a thing that they would practice on. Then they would go into the West Bank and they would police civilians. And there's no aha moment of like, okay, we know we trained you for war, but now what we actually want you to do is make sure the Palestinians keep their heads down.
Yeah, and nobody's saying all that out loud.
Right.
It's just kind of like between the lines, you're supposed to understand all of that.
Or when they are saying it out loud, they're saying it out loud as a military necessity. Right?
Yeah, because they're all terrorists. It's so
exactly.
This is justified.
Exactly. Like there is this thing when you're in the West Bank and you're a soldier, it's not that everyone necessarily you're looking at them through your scope and the eyes of everyone is one for one a terrorist, but everyone is a potential terrorist.
Yeah.
Right? And then the vast majority of what the army does on a daily basis is to stop potential terrorists, right? Which literally is anyone. It could be a 3-year-old girl. It could be a grandfather. If you're a Palestinian guy between the ages of 15 and 50, right? First and foremost, the assumption is you might be a terrorist. And so there's no space in occupied territory for people to make human decisions, right? Palestinians, I mean. Palestinians who are working on their own land, but it's too close to a settlement. Palestinians who are driving too fast. Palestinians who are too close to an Israeli road, right? All of these things are suspicious.
Or living in a refugee camp, which is already making you more of a suspicion than any other Palestinian.
Just by being a refugee, you're considered more suspicious.
Yeah.
Right? Which is crazy. And I remember that a few times I guarded settlements when I was in my service. And I just remember the first time guarding a settlement in the northern West Bank. And there was no fence around the settlement. And it's funny because, again, I had this concept that I was against settlements, but I couldn't put it into words and I couldn't understand the system. So I was like bummed knowing that I was going to guard a settlement, but it didn't change any of my actions, of course, right? And we're going to guard the settlement. And the thing that I think people don't always understand is when you're guarding a settlement, so it's like I wasn't even a combat soldier. Like I was what's called a supporter of combat. Like what the hell do I know about guarding and like caring for civilian lives? Genuinely, like no one trained me how to do that. And you basically would stand like, I think we were like 4 soldiers in one settlement, and then you'd have other soldiers in another settlement and other soldiers in another settlement. And the officer is just like going from settlement to settlement, right? They're not actually with you all the time. So the person that you are actually getting commands from is the Ravshatz, the civilian security coordinator of the settlement, which what they're supposed to do is just ensure the security of their settlement within the borders of their settlement, right? And you have those who exist also like in Israel, like not in the West Bank, who like kind of more or less do that, right? Like you have someone like the border of Jordan, and like that's like kind of for the most part what they do. Their like job is pretty insignificant. But in settlements today, I know that that job is very much a political job in trying to often expand the settlement. And that moment, I was standing there and the civilian security coordinator was telling us where to stand. And it was amazing because we had been given no maps. We saw no maps at all. And he was telling us basically to stand fairly far away from the settlement, but also to look down into the valley. And it's like we were on one hill and on the other hill was a Palestinian village. And he said, if you see Arabs coming down from that village into the valley, well, then they're coming on to the settlement grounds and you need to go like kick them out. And I just remember thinking like, but what if it's theirs? Like if you could visualize it, it's basically a Palestinian village. And then everything up until the valley, including the valley, is clearly agriculture belonging to that village. There's no like space between the village and the agriculture. It just kind of runs into each other. And so I remember thinking, I don't know if I should listen to this guy. And then my officer came back because they weren't there when we got that original command. And this guy's not supposed to be giving us commands, right? And so I said, hey, are we supposed to listen to the civilian security coordinator?
Who's a resident of a settlement.
Who's a resident of the settlement who has a weapon. I didn't know it at the time, but is paid by the Ministry of Defense. And my officer says, yeah, whatever he says. And then I go to that guy and I say, why don't you put up a fence? It would be a lot easier for us to defend the settlement if there was a fence. It would make our job a lot easier. And he looks around and there's like all these different Palestinian villages and he just like kind of throws his arms out and is like, because all of this is ours. And it was one of those really clear moments when you think, I don't think this is a security mission as much as it's a political mission. And years later, that's so obvious. At the time, you're still confused because you're in this reality of constantly you're being talked about as security. And also you don't want to mess up. Like you don't want to be the reason that someone is killed, you know? And what do I know? I'm thinking to myself, like, I'm not even a combatant. Like literally, what do I know? You know, situations like that just continued over and over and over again during my service. When I finally walked out and had a moment to think about it, I really started slowly getting cracks in the system of what I had participated in. I remember my mom came to visit towards the end of my service. So obviously I also would wash like the shirts that said things like 1 shot, 1 kill. And I thought these shirts were so cool. But when my mom came to visit, I remember hiding it from her.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Why?
Because I think that underneath it, I had this tension of feeling like this is really cool to also knowing that this is not okay. Like knowing that if I was in like the suburb of Philadelphia that I grew up in and I walked around with that shirt in like the mall, that would be racist. But when you're in it, it's so all-encompassing, right? And it's not even just like, this is why I think a lot of ways the indoctrination is so strong, because it's not just the fact that these shirts exist. It's the fact that the instructor, the weapons instructor who left the army, and I was their favorite, gave me this shirt right? You feel so, and you know you're going to pass it down to your favorite instructor that like, towards the end of my service, I did the instructing course. I taught instructors how to be instructors, you know, figuring out who am I going to give my notebook to? Who am I going to give this shirt to? There's a collectiveness to it.
It's a sorority.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
Kind of. I mean, I used to say it feels like summer camp. And that's like, it's so messed up. And if I remember in basic training, I would be like, it feels like summer camp. Or a lot of the girls would be like, oh, it feels like Tzofim, which is like the Israeli scouts. And all of our commanders were like, no, it's not like the scouts. It's not like summer camp. But it is. Like, and that's a really messed up feeling when I look back on it, and how much on one hand, I think have these moments of feeling uncomfortable, but how on the other hand, in the day-to-day, the reality is that I enjoyed it. It feels really weird for me to say that now. You know, I feel like if I was listening to me, I would be judging me. But yeah, of course, I enjoyed it. You know, I liked the learning. I liked teaching people. I'm a very friendly person. I liked interacting with the soldiers. You know, I liked feeling like I did a good week. I moved up in my job all the time, you know?
By the way, speaking of the sorority, I remember when my mother grew up in the US, and I remember when I was trying out for all the different jobs in the military where you're in 12th grade and you want to get like the best options, and you have all these like different options, and you go and you interview for them, or you go in these like tryout days, and my mother was calling it's like sorority rush.
Wow.
It is. I guess like only Americans would understand this reference, but it's kind of like this feeling of like, you know, they all have their own, each one of the jobs or the positions or the units have their own like pride. You know, they're in Hebrew we call it gavat yichida, the unit's pride.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of feeding all of the soldiers, each one in their unit, of like, it's not about being proud that you're a soldier in the Israeli military. It's more about being proud that you're in your unit.
Exactly.
And I think this isn't a coincidence. I think that they know that putting you in this tight-knit collective, all for one and one for all, you know, and we're all proud of being part of this unit. And we're handing down these t-shirts to each other, or handing down these, like, you know, all these different, that's where the people feel like they're part of something.
Yeah. These things really, really pull you in. And I mean, there was a lot of moments that I questioned what we were doing, but there was no one there to question it with me. In fact, every time I tried to open my mouth and think critically of what was going on, I was very actively shut down. Very actively. I remember one time pretty early on, I was learning how to become a shooting instructor. And one of the things you do is you learn ballistics of the gun. So you have like inner ballistics, outer ballistics, and final ballistics, which is like how the bullet works, like inside the gun, in the air, and when it hits its target. And in the hitting of the target, it basically is like, how does it hit the body, and how does that work? And one of the things we learned about was all the different bullets that exist. So you have like the full metal jacket, which is the most standard bullet. It doesn't matter the size. It's just a standard bullet. And then you have things like dum-dum and soft tip, and I don't remember all the names now. But you have one that like is basically like teeth, hollow point. You have hollow point, and then you have a hollow point that like has that, like the hollow point is just, it doesn't have a point, it's hollow. And then you have one that has teeth, and then you have one that has like something else put in it so that your muscle, like if you're hit with a bullet, can't easily kind of like go back together. I'm like not thinking of the scientific word, but basically so that like the bleeding can't stop so easily. And it's really, really dangerous to the body. And I remember we were learning about all of these bullets, and I raised my hand and asked my officer who was teaching the class, like, well, we're not medics, and all of these bullets except for full metal jacket are illegal in international law, so why are we learning about them? And I swear I asked the question innocently.
How did you know they were against international law?
I don't know. I just knew. Maybe I asked, like, aren't these against international law? Or maybe they said it. Mm-hmm. I actually don't remember like how I knew, but I knew that only full metal jacket was. And the officer said, Becca, there are questions that you don't ask. you know? And it really quieted me down. And I remember walking out of that lesson thinking that someone would come up to me and be like, oh, I also was wondering that. You know, like someone else also questioning, someone else also feeling uncomfortable. There was no one. No one. And I went home that weekend and I talked to my friend who was an instructor on a different weapon. She wasn't a shooting instructor. And I just turned to her and I said, like, how do you feel about the fact that we're teaching, like, I believe in defense, right? That's what I told myself at the time. But how do you feel about the fact that we're teaching people to kill people? And she said, no, don't think about that. We're not doing that. We're teaching defense. But of course, that's the only thing I've thought about every single day, every single time there's been something in Gaza, which in the past year, in this like very genocidal war, has been every single day. Every single day I think about how many of the soldiers who have gone into Gaza, who have killed people, how many of them learned from me how to shoot a gun. I think about that every single day. And I don't think I'll ever get over it. I don't think anything that I can do to try and end the occupation, to try and end the bloodshed, to try and end the inequality and the injustice today will ever take that question out of my mind. I don't think you can ever repair what you participated in. You can maybe also do good, but it doesn't change what you already participated in.
Wow. What you just told me actually reminds me of a story of a friend that when he was in the military, they were teaching them about different weapons or different things that you can, bomb population with. And they were teaching them about white phosphorus. Mm-hmm. And he was like, but why are you teaching us about white phosphorus if it's against international law? Like they were teaching what it can do. And he was like, but you said we're not supposed to be using this. So why are you teaching us about it?
Right.
And I think, and he was telling me about like, this was one of the moments where I was like, but so maybe they're telling us we're not supposed to be using this, but kind of like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, but actually eventually we might be using it.
Right.
So just in case you should learn, because even though it's against the rules, we might be using it anyway, and we know it. So we're preparing.
Yeah. It's really amazing how much of these things, when you aren't given the tools to think critically, and Israelis now, a lot of what I do again is working with Israeli education systems. Not only are we not taught to think critically, we're taught to think very much in a herd-like manner,
Yeah.
And so then when you're taught this stuff, it's really amazing how few people are questioning it, And of course, it goes much, much deeper. If you're an infantry soldier who served in kind of any unit and spent time in the West Bank, the odds that you went into someone's house randomly in the middle of the night, gathered the family for the Palestinian family for no reason other than to make your presence felt, which is a very common command, just make your presence felt, so that the average Palestinian will feel too afraid to lift their head up and resist. And then that includes nonviolent resistance and violent resistance, right? That includes like student unions.
Yeah.
That includes protests. And I've talked to so many people who've gone into houses and who've gone into many houses and who've said, yeah, but we had specific information, and then you talk to the officers and you'll find all these officers who said, oh yeah, and I just picked that house.
There was no information.
There was no information, right? The information is that is that the occupation is indefinite, and therefore we need Palestinians to keep their heads down indefinitely.
Yeah.
And how many soldiers, though, will convince themselves that that's right? And to an extent, I understand it from the place that when you are in Israeli society, we think of morality as being in the army.
Yeah.
Right? Like the moral thing to do is to be a soldier
in the moral army.
Exactly. And that then makes us feel like anything that is part of the army is moral, and anything that is questioning what the army is doing is immoral.
It's immoral. Yeah.
Or the military phrase for the education corps in the military is Am bone tzava bone am. The people build an army, build a people.
Yeah.
And you can really see how that's kind of come full circle, because
it's also designed in a circle.
Yeah,
it's like this loop.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you really see that where it's like if people actually then start questioning about the house that they went into, or the people that they arrested, or the people they did a mock arrest on, which is going through a whole entire arrest and then on a person they know is innocent just to practice and then letting them go at the end. If you really start to question that, then you'll say, wait a minute, is what I'm doing moral? Not only does it change everything you've been taught up until this moment,
everything.
But if you say it out loud, then people will call you a traitor. I know people who their families don't speak to them anymore. You know, I know people who have been, have basically been kicked out of their friend groups, have been kicked out of their families. You know, I consider myself lucky that I've gotten support from my family for the most part. For me, my watershed moment was in the war in Gaza in 2014, and one of the first things I remember was seeing this guy being interviewed. He was probably in his 40s, and he was being interviewed in an army uniform. He was down at the border, and he was saying, you know, I didn't want to leave my 2 kids at home, but I want to be a moral person. So when I got the call for reserve duty, of course I'm going to come because I want my kids to be proud of me. I want to do the right moral thing. And I just think about like how different that is, right? Like when we talk about the people having the conversation inside Israel and the people having the conversation outside of Israel, we're really not having the same conversation because
these are parallel universes.
Completely parallel universes. And this guy is sure that he's doing the moral thing and that what he's doing is defense. And I mean, this guy was in the Air Force, you know, he wasn't a pilot, but he absolutely was in part of the system that was, you know, dropping bombs on Palestinians in Gaza. And that moment always stuck with me because in 2014, I was a student. I was in my last year of studies. And I was working at this organization called Gisha, which is a human rights organization that focuses on the freedom of movement to and from Gaza. Mainly for like people. I mean, like people have freedoms, but it also focused on goods, being able to enter and exit Gaza. And I started working there in something like November of 2013. And it was a student job. I basically was switching someone who worked at the front desk. And I once a week and then later twice a week. And I think by the summer I was working there 3 times a week, would answer the phones. And then I would basically pass on, you know, depending on what the conversation was, I would pass them on to the person who needed to deal with whatever it was that they needed. And some of the examples were a woman who was accepted into a university in the UK. I think it was Oxford, though. I don't totally remember, but I remember it being a really good university. She was like 18 or 19 years old, and she needed permission from Israel to travel from the Gaza Strip through Israel, through the West Bank, so she could go to Jordan and fly from Jordan. And you need to get a permit from Israel to do that, right?
This is like 4 or 5 different like journeys across borders.
It's crazy. And what people don't realize is people will dismiss information like that and be like, well, she could have just gone through Egypt. But that's not true.
Yeah.
If when Palestinians travel through Egypt, they can only then come back from Egypt. And the Rafah border, especially during those years, was closed more often than it was open. And also, Rafah is really far away from Cairo. Like, you have the whole entire Sinai Peninsula. So most things that people need for travel, the Sinai Peninsula is just unhelpful, right? Like, if you need medical help, the Sinai Peninsula can't help you. If you want to reunite with your family in the West Bank or in Israel, going to the Sinai Peninsula is unhelpful. If you want to go to a work-related conference in the West Bank, going to Sinai is unhelpful. But also, if you travel as a Palestinian with a Palestinian ID, and it's through it's like the Palestinian Authority ID, but the group in charge of it is the Israeli military, right? The Israeli military holds the Palestinian population registry. And if you travel through the Sinai Peninsula, you're considered by the Israeli military to basically have like escaped illegally, even though you can legally go through Rafah. And so then you're not going to be able to come back ever through Israel. And what they'll do is if you come through the West Bank, then the Israeli military will often say, okay, yeah, you can go. We'll send you this one time to Gaza, but you can never leave again. Who's going to say yes to that, right? Yeah. Like, so she needed to travel and she couldn't get a permit. Like, she wasn't getting a permit. It wasn't clear why she wasn't getting a permit. And you get cases like this a lot where sometimes people won't get a permit and it's not totally clear why. And sometimes they'll say it's for security reasons, but there's no reason for someone to have not have the security clearance. But the reality is that like if someone is considered to be like if someone's part of Hamas, not considered to be, if someone's like part of Hamas, like could be a fighter, but also could be like a teacher in the education ministry of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, it's possible that like their first or second cousin will have a travel ban, right? Which is crazy because we're really used to thinking about access as like we can move freely and there's very specific criteria in which we can't move. Right? If you've committed a crime and like you're in jail or you're out on bail or you're on some special black list, then you can't, right? But for Palestinians in Gaza, it's the opposite. You can't travel unless you fit a very, very, very specific criteria. And so like, you know, the blanket answer is no, and then maybe we'll consider. There's other people I remember talking to who would call me who wanted family reunification. And I would just answer the phone every single moment. It's like the phone, I would finish a conversation, the phone would ring. I'd finish the conversation, the phone would ring. I would often like eat at my desk to not miss some of these calls. And the war broke out in 2014 and no one called. Just no one. I think the whole entire first few weeks, there was maybe 2 people who called from outside of Gaza who were trying to get their family out. And there was nothing we could do. Rafah was closed. Like there was no movement. And that was just the loudest silence I've ever heard. And at the time, I was still technically in reserve duty. And I thought because of friends and other people I knew who had been called to reserve duty, I thought there was a chance that I was going to be called. And that was the first time that I remember thinking, wow, I don't think I can do this, you know? And now, of course, I'm like really tapped into the like activist world and you know, I'm an organizer against the occupation. But at the time, I was on one hand working in a human rights organization, but it was really happen chance. Like I like generally believed in human rights and like I was free on Tuesdays when they needed someone, you know? And I just remember thinking, how could I go like zeroing guns on the entrance to Gaza where all the soldiers were? How can I zero in the guns of soldiers and then go back and talk to Gazans like on the phone and like help, you know, facilitate their legal needs?
I also remember you telling a story about someone calling and saying, you know, my son is 8 years old or something like that, right?
Yeah, there was a kid who visited his family in Gaza. Like he was European, I don't remember from which country, but his grandparents lived in Gaza. And he was visiting for the summer, right? Like, and he got there before the war broke out and before anyone knew that a war was going to break out. And he was stuck there. And his family called, I don't remember if it was during the war or at some point after the war, but basically was called and they were trying to get him out of Gaza because he came through Rafah. And the Rafah border was closed after the war in 2014. But because he came through Rafah, the Israeli military was unwilling to facilitate this, I believe he was 8 years old, this 8-year-old kid from basically leaving through the border with Israel and then the West Bank and then Jordan and then flying to Europe where he lived. And so for months during the war and after the war, he was stuck in Gaza with his grandparents, right? I mean, can you just imagine like going to visit your grandparents in another country during the summer, something that so many of us have done also, you know, those of us who are from multiple places in the world, going to visit your grandparents in the summer or your family in the summer, getting stuck in a war, and then just this whole entire bureaucratic violent system saying, oh, there's nothing we can do. There's everything you can do. You're the system. You're the control. You make the parameters of who can travel, and you've decided not to let this little kid go. And I know today, like with everything in Gaza, how many orphans there are and how many kids have lost contact with their family. I know that one story is so small compared. There's so many stories like that today.
Yeah.
But it still is one of those stories that has always stuck with me at like the banality of evil. Yeah. You know, the banality of the system and what working in Gisha and what working around the issue of Gaza made me realize was just how much of the occupation, how much of the evil of occupation is bureaucracy.
Oh yeah. There's a researcher Her name is Dr. Yael Barda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
She literally wrote her PhD about
that.
The bureaucracy, how the bureaucracy of occupation is the thing.
Yeah, that is exactly, that is the thing. I mean, if going back to a second for Instagram, that's a lot of the...
That's why I asked that.
Yeah, that's
like you're breaking down all of that really hard stuff to understand because it's meant to be hard to understand. It's meant for Palestinians not to understand it so that they can't even navigate through it to get their basic needs met.
It's really insane. Like I think one of the Breaking the Silence, where I worked for 7 years up until recently, has this one testimony that I think tells the whole entire story of Gaza. And it's this guy basically saying he served in COGAT, which is the Coordinated Offices of Government of the Territories. I think I probably mistranslated that, but they're basically like the military body responsible for civilian needs, and they function in the West Bank as the civil administration and as COGAT in Gaza. And his job was counting how much bulgur wheat went into Gaza on any given day. Like that was one of his missions, right? And it wasn't during a war. It was just during some random time in between these rounds of fighting that are happening every few years. And he said, it was that moment that I realized the control that we have comes down to not just how much of trucks of bulgur wheat goes into Gaza, but how many grains of bulgur go into Gaza. That's our level of control. And I think it's really interesting today with this whole entire talk about is aid getting into Gaza, starvation, not starvation. One of the things that Gisha uncovered in like 2011 or 12, they uncovered, was that between 2007 and 2010, there was a mathematical equation of how many calories had to go into Gaza based on the population that would allow people not to starve, but in which they wouldn't be better than not starving, right? Like what was the smallest amount basically that had to go in? And that a lot of the closure, the siege early on, really things weren't getting in. And so, of course, we can do that today. We literally have the mathematical equation.
And we've been doing it for so long.
Yeah.
And I think this mathematical equation, or what I heard was a very, very big kind of Google sheet, kind of Excel sheet with all the different, goods and how many calories they have and then how many people. And then you kind of like divide the people with calories. And I think that level of control of the calories that enter a certain amount, a certain area with millions of people living in it. I think that, for me, it's enough to know that to counter the argument of like, oh, well, we left Gaza in 2005.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if we were controlling the calories entering that place, then we did not leave.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different ways to control a population. And the fact that you don't have military presence of infantry soldiers inside and or settlements does not mean you really left. It does not mean you don't control their lives to the extent of the calories that can enter their bodies.
Right.
Like, I really, really wish that every single Israeli knew that small, not very,
piece of information.
Yeah, it's not small, but it's small in the sense that it just takes, 20 seconds to say it. And it really means so much.
Right.
I just wish everybody would know that. And then they would stop with that bullshit of like, well, we left Gaza and they could have turned it into Singapore and they used all the money to create terror infrastructure. Well, they also were being controlled to the extent of calories.
Right.
So,
and calories just one thing.
Yeah, that's only one thing. Of course, there was all the other
building materials. And I remember once there was someone on a tour that I did to Hebron talking about, well, aren't we generous because if we wanted to wipe out Gaza, we would.
Then we would. That's one of the main arguments for a lot of Israelis now.
Yeah. And this was, I don't know, maybe back in like 2020 or 2021, like it was a few years ago. And I said, look, control is never generous. Just because right now we're not
it's not yours to control in the first place. You're not generous for not eliminating a people. That doesn't make you generous or moral.
And also when you have that control, to expect that one group will control another group and will constantly measure itself to make sure that that control is somehow generous or okay is completely unrealistic. That's not how control works. It's a form of abuse. It's always a form of abuse.
And it's missing the point. The fact that the control is there in the first place is wrong.
The problem.
That's the problem. Not how we're using that control, how much force we're using, how much are we limiting our force? Because we could potentially use more force. And then people are asking in Israel, well, we're limiting our force so much because we're the most moral army in the world. And then you're saying the problem is not how much we're limiting or not limiting our control. The problem is that we're controlling people.
Exactly.
Like that should be a basic understanding, and it's not.
That's what I always say. People is like, the question here is not like the soldier who smiles at a Palestinian the checkpoint, or the soldier who slaps a Palestinian at the checkpoint. The problem is the checkpoint.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I look back on 2014 when all of these things, you know, I didn't understand at all what was going on in Gaza when I was in the army. It wasn't something I dealt with. It wasn't something that I focused on. I didn't know what the civil administration or Kogat were, but I learned a lot when I was in Gisha. And I just remember that war and that reality and the silence, the lack of calls, and understanding for the first time how great our control was. And I just remember thinking, wow, if I get called to reserves, I can't go. And now that seems like such an obvious answer to me. But at the time, it was devastating because, you know, I had been a lone soldier. You know, lone soldiers are like really gung-ho on Zionism and the army. That's the thing that connects us all together, is we all served here without our immediate family here.
You were very invested.
I was very invested. And like so many of my friends were former lone soldiers. And some of those friends were in Gaza at the time. And I knew that I would lose them. I knew that I would lose my community pretty much completely. And it's not like today where I have a lot of clarity around this. I was really feeling like my identity in crisis. I mean, I remember I used to have this scholarship for being a lone soldier. It wasn't like, we're not like missionaries. It's not like I knew I was going to get a scholarship like when I went to join the army, but it turns out there's a scholarship for former lone soldiers, and I got it. That helped me pay for school. And I would be in the office in Gisha, and we'd be like looking at what was happening in Gaza. And like, there's also a field worker who works at Gisha. And like, we just were constantly like, how is his family? Like worried, is he going to be okay? And like, in Gaza.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I would then like leave from work, and I would be like, okay, I'm going to go package like food for soldiers on the border, like at where my scholarship was. You know, they would be like, we need people to come volunteer, and be like, yeah, sure, I'll go do. Like, that's how much my identity was like split at that moment, until I got to the point where I just said, I can't go. Like, if I get called, I can't go. I know now that there are people in Gaza who are just people. I know this is like so basic. Of course, there are people in Gaza who are people, but I'd never talked to a Gazan, like I'd never talked to a Palestinian from Gaza before. I had absolutely no idea what I believed, that we had left Gaza, until I started working at Gisha. I had no idea. And I wrote a letter that I was going to give to my boss if I was called to reserve duty. And I was planning on going to jail. I packed my bag for jail in case I got called to reserve duty. And it took like another month, but like me and my girlfriend broke up over it. Right? Like, she was like, how could you, I think her brother I don't know if he was in Gaza or he was on the border at the time, but he was there. And, you know, it just was something that no one does. I mean, who doesn't go if you're called? And I wasn't just not going to go. I was going to make a statement of it, because I really felt like all of a sudden I had an idea of who people in Gaza were, and I couldn't stand behind it. I mean, I really felt broken, and they never called. I never got called to reserve duty. But for me, it was this kind of watershed moment of realizing that I have to end the occupation. At the end of the summer of 2014, I was like, all right, well, I guess I got to go to the West Bank, you know? And that's when I started crossing into the West Bank. And that's when I started discovering that there are activists, that there are people fighting the occupation daily. That's when I started learning how, you know, land registration works, and home demolitions, and
All the ugly bureaucracy.
Yeah, all the ugly bureaucracy. Like I had seen like the guarding of settlements and a bit of the policing, and a bit of sterilizing areas, like making it so Palestinians can't walk there in the West Bank. I had seen all of those things a little bit, but you don't necessarily realize when you're in it. When you're a soldier, it's hard to know if what you're doing is just something you're doing or if it's systematic, because you're only in one place at one time in one position.
That's actually very important, because you know how there's like the metaphor of like, a few blind people and they're all feeling an elephant from different angles?
Yeah.
So one is feeling the tail and one is feeling the trunk and one is feeling the... And so they're all describing what they're feeling, and it sounds like they're all describing something else, but they're all on this one animal, right?
Right.
So I think this applies to soldiers in general, but specifically soldiers in Gaza right now, or soldiers that are doing something related to Gaza, like the units bombing Gaza from the air, even if physically they're not in Gaza, but there are also Israeli soldiers in Gaza. And I hear a lot of them coming back and saying, well, I was there. I know. I've seen it. You haven't been there, so you don't know.
Right.
You're just getting your information from the media, but I was there with my own body. And I always want to tell these soldiers that you saw something so specific.
Right.
You saw with your 2 eyes, 2 ears, the one specific place that you were in.
No one soldier can tell the whole entire story. And actually, one of the things that we've seen about the occupation, a lot of times people ask me, like, what's changed about the occupation over the past decades? And one of the major things that's changed about the occupation is the use of technology. And so, for example, like the use of AI, like target banks and even AI weaponry in the current war in Gaza is a really great example of that, where it actually, what it does is it allows the soldier to say, I didn't do anything wrong.
Oh, yeah. I didn't make that decision.
I didn't make that decision. I didn't pull the trigger. And to an extent, that's actually more and more, it's not, in Gaza specifically, soldiers are also doing a lot of things, but with the use of technology, it's often somewhat true, but it doesn't change it doesn't change that the outcome,
the damage that's done, right? I mean, like, we're not having, and this is where I think kind of a lot of times the legal conversation on things like this falls so short, is we're not really having a conversation just about intent. We're having a conversation about outcome, right? Yeah. And, if you're a soldier who is serving in the West Bank today, checkpoints for the most part, it depends where they are, and I don't want to generalize, but you have a lot of checkpoints now that they're so technology based that you're, as a soldier, not actually touching the Palestinians going through the checkpoint, right? But that doesn't mean that the Palestinian is being checked less. Exactly.
More so, I mean, in Hebron, Palestinians in some neighborhoods have numbers attached to them. Right. And you have like the use of technology that you can actually follow people on the streets. I mean, it's called Hebron Smart City. It's this whole, like, the center of Hebron around where the settlements are is completely technology filled, right? So yeah, the individual soldier isn't maybe patting down the Palestinian in the same way in that moment. They are in other moments, but isn't in that moment. But that doesn't mean that the Palestinian is somehow less occupied or less harmed or less traumatized.
So then you have soldiers that in their experience are doing something clean, quote unquote, or something unharmful or unviolent.
Right.
They don't understand the violence because they're not the ones that it's running their lives.
It's being done to.
Exactly. So you're talking about these testimonies from soldiers, and you worked in Breaking the Silence for 7 years.
I did.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So I started working on Breaking the Silence in 2018. At this point, I was already an activist. I was an organizer in the West Bank. I was doing educational work. I worked for this organization called Tzedakah Re'ut, which maybe we'll talk about later. And I was offered to lead the education department at Breaking the Silence. And at Breaking the Silence, I actually think do amazing education work. Some of the, I think, best geopolitical tours that exist on this land. And we basically take people to Hebron, and we take people to the South Hebron Hills. And we also do a lot of other, sit on panels and educational work. But we basically explain how the system functions through us, the soldiers who did it. And kind of what we were just talking about, I think the strength of Breaking the Silence is a combination of soldiers being able to say, I did this.
To take responsibility.
To take responsibility. Like I did. A lot of people will say you're bad talking soldiers, but actually we're just talking about what we did. That's one strength. And I think the other strength though is being able to take this whole entire system and look when you have soldiers' testimony from different years, from different areas, from different units, and you can say, well, actually now we can explain how the system works. It's not just a question of is it moral or immoral. Of course, controlling other people indefinitely is immoral. But how does it work? How does it maintain itself? How does it deepen? How are settlements expanded?
What are the policies?
How, what's the purpose of settler violence? I think that as a soldier, settler violence seems like this thing that, you're just frustrated at the army. Like, why aren't they just dealing with it? Why are they there's a new outpost. Why isn't the army just not securing it? Why does the army have to secure it? I used to be so mad about that as a soldier.
You're like, why don't they just let them,
why don't they just let them do their thing? And if they get hurt, that's on them.
Yeah. I used to ask that when I was younger.
Yeah, I think a lot of soldiers ask that in the moment. But when you look at all the testimonies together and you put it together also with information that Palestinians have and that other groups have. So when you see all of that together, you realize that, settler violence is the way that the state expands its land.
Exactly. It's a tool.
It's a tool. It's not a
byproduct of the settlement movement, but rather it's a tool used to expand the settlement movement.
Exactly. And it's not just like racism in the sense of like,
it's not
they
hate speech.
Arabs.
Yeah,
exactly. This is a tool and it's used because it works.
It's ideologically motivated violence because it's part of a strategy. It's not just not that I'm underplaying school shootings or, any terror attacks anywhere. But it's not just someone woke up in the morning and decided, I'm a white supremacist, I'm just going to shoot everyone. No, it's part of a movement. Exactly. And it's part of state policy.
Exactly. And so I think being able to show that to people is really, really powerful. As the director of education at Breaking the Silence, and then later I was the senior director, I learned a lot working with the Israeli public, which is the vast majority of what I do. The first being that the hardest thing in terms of teaching about the occupation is to get people to get on the bus. Like you're bringing them on a tour to Hebron. If you bring them on a tour to Hebron, the odds of not moving them at all when you're walking on sterilized streets, like sterilized from Palestinians, that's the military word, clean from Palestinians. Palestinians can't walk there. People can't walk outside their front door in Hebron on some streets. The odds of not being able to move someone is very slim. You move people. And when you bring people to listen to Palestinians, all of the tours of Breaking the Silence involve Palestinians who we partner with, who come and speak. And we partner with them, but we're not telling them what to say. We're not, for Israelis to be able to have an unfiltered conversation with Palestinians is almost unheard of.
Yeah.
Even when you have like educational groups or like pre-military academies, go and have conversation with Palestinians. It's the word Palestinian usually isn't used. It's usually Arab. And they are very specific voices that are not going to challenge the people sitting in the room very much, right?
Yeah.
And you have it from, they'll be somewhat critical but not very challenging, on one part of the scale to like Yosef Haddad, who's actively doing Hasbara work on the other side. But the point is at most is to walk out and be like, oh, wow, that's really complicated. But when you bring Israelis to actually hear Palestinians speak about their reality and also what they want, it's very hard not to be moved. I think one of the proudest moments I ever had was working with a group of Israelis who were part of a youth movement. Like they were the staff of a youth movement, and they see themselves as left, but a very Zionist left. They don't deal with the occupation. They were blown away. They had no, I mean one for one, except for one guy on that weekend seminar that I did for these educators. One guy served in the occupied territories and no one else did, and they were blown away. And I just remember one of the guys saying, we brought them to the Educational Bookshop, which is this bookshop in East Jerusalem, and had a conversation with the owner there. Mahmoud, and he's both like a really smart, thoughtful guy, Mahmoud.
Mahmoud Muna.
Yeah, Mahmoud Muna, and definitely is kind of, an intellectual type, and I think has a lot of interesting things to say about East Jerusalem that, are his to say and not mine. But I remember when we did the circle, processing circle that night, and one of the Israeli guys said, what was really hard for me hearing Mahmoud was I couldn't feel bad for him. He just challenged me. I realized I was sitting across from my equal.
Oh, wow.
And those are the type of moments that I know that's so simple.
It's so sad
Israelis,
that it's so unique.
It's so unique for Israelis to be able to sit and hear a Palestinian voice, and that Palestinian voice challenge them as an equal.
And not just a victim.
Yeah. Not someone I can feel bad for, not someone I can feel sympathy for. And that's one of the things also that, at Breaking the Silence, we do tours in Hebron and the South Hebron Hills. And in the South Hebron Hills, it's one of the things that I'm always thinking about, because you bring people to these villages, and these villages do not have the rights to build. Like, they don't have master plans. They're completely 100% directly under the auspices and control of the Israeli army. The Israeli army does not give these villages the ability to build. So they're all living in tents and caravans. They don't have running water, most of them. They don't
or shacks.
Yeah, they're like shacks. They don't have electricity, or there's a little bit of electricity. And one of the things that I don't want to happen in these conversations when we bring people to these villages is to walk away feeling bad. I don't want someone to feel bad for the people of Susia. I don't want people to feel bad for the people of Tuani. I don't think that's, in the conversations that I've had over the years also with partners in these places, I don't think they're looking to be victims.
Yeah.
They're equal.
Yeah.
And they're demanding their equality.
Yeah, yeah.
And rightfully so. And so I think, bringing people, that's such a hard, getting someone to say, oh, wow, I couldn't feel bad for this guy. He challenged me, and that was hard for me. To me, that felt like a big win. And that's why it's so hard, going back to getting people to Hebron and getting people to South Hebron. That's why it's so hard to get people on the bus. Because we don't want our narrative to be broken down. We don't want to actually see what we're doing on the other side, because then it goes back to that, that conversation, that interview I saw of that guy during the war in 2014 saying, of course, when the army called, I went and I joined because I want to be moral.
Yeah.
When you sit down with Mahmoud Muna, when you sit down with Isa Amro, when you sit down with Nasser Nawaje, they're going to make you question that. And that's literally breaking down the whole system of indoctrination that the state has built. And I think that doing it also from the perspective of soldiers who served the system, who know the system, is very important. Not because it's the only story to tell. It's also important to say that I really value Breaking the Silence testimony. And I've learned, I think, to value it even more in the 7 years that I was there, its importance. But it's important to say, if you read Breaking the Silence testimony, Palestinians are objects. You go into a house and you gather the family and you arrest the father, the brother, and you have no idea what happened to that family before, and you have no idea what happened to that family after, and you don't know what their name is, and you don't know who they are. They're objects.
And you never will.
And Palestinians aren't objects. Again, talking about this concept of, are we equal? If we really close our eyes and we pause and we think do I really see Palestinians as equal? I think even for most Israelis who are critical, that's a genuinely hard thing to do. And one of the things that I really took away from Breaking the Silence, and this is part of also just my time as an organizer over the past decade and a bit, is that as Israelis, we tend to do our activism through a lens of guilt.
Yeah.
Right?
Of course.
And I also feel that guilt. It's not, I said it before, I will always feel this level of guilt of the system that I participated in and the specific, shooting instructing that I did. But I remember once in 2016, we were in Hebron. This is before I was with Breaking the Silence. And I got arrested. And we were taken down to the police station. And the police questioned us. And, we were told we couldn't go to Hebron for like 2 weeks or a month. I don't remember. But when I was getting arrested, I remember looking in the eyes of the soldiers who were there, and I was meeting their eyes, and I felt so much shame looking at the eyes of this soldier and looking at his military uniform. And I felt so weird thinking about how the same way in that moment I felt shame, I once wore that uniform and felt a lot of pride. And I had a moment when I was being driven off to the police station where I kind of realized that shame and pride are two emotions that are very ego-centered. They're basically on the same axis. And that what I should really be thinking about more is what's my responsibility, because I'm not at the center of the situation, right? And I really wasn't. Like, the day ended. At some point, we got let out of the police station. We had to, I think, pay a fine, and we couldn't go to Hebron for a few weeks. And that's it. I wasn't the center of this story. I'm not living in Tel Umeda. So one of the things that I tried to do, both while at Breaking the Silence and a lot of the projects that I worked on while there, was how do we create a left that is functioning through the eyes of responsibility. And when you look through the eyes of responsibility, it's both what's our responsibility to Palestinians, right? As the people that we are controlling and we are occupying. But also, what's the responsibility to ourselves, which I think is a question that we're often not really asking. And basically, what's the responsibility to the movement? So while I was at Breaking the Silence, a lot of the things were trying to focus on how do we strengthen the movement, And one of the first things I remember was you get these educational platforms, like these educational groups coming to Hebron, and you talk to them about the occupation for 3 hours, 6 hours, something like that. But you're not another voice in a conversation that exists, and you're just adding your perspective, right? Or you're adding in your information. That's not what's going on with these groups. You are giving them a totally new set of information in a totally new discourse that they weren't engaging in up until now. And if they're 18 and they're instructors or coordinators of these groups are in their 20s or in their 30s, they weren't a part of that discourse either. When you would take an educational group to Hebron in 2004, there was still some discourse, maybe not really about the occupation, but at least about state solutions, right? Or state agreements. That's not even on the table anymore. It's a non-starter. It's a non-question, which again goes back to the funniness of how much the world talks about the two-state solution. No one is talking about that here. Right? And so in 2004, maybe educational groups said, okay, I don't agree with what's happening in Hebron, so I guess I'll agree with that state solution or that state agreement. Today, it's just oh, wow, this sucks, which then that's not motivating to people. That's not making people want to become involved in the movement. And so it's much easier to try and explain it away to yourself if you're an 18-year-old who's about to enlist in the army. And so I said, we need to be able to make this discourse for them greater. We need to work with the coordinators. We need to work with their instructors. We need to work with the educational staff. And so then we started doing seminars for educators called The Land Beyond the Mountains, which is such a perfect name because, in the West Bank, you have these mountains in the center. And really what's going on those mountains and on the other side of them for most Israelis is just no one has any idea.
Including people who are educating.
Oh, definitely. So, the seminar has been going on since 2019. I personally led probably something somewhere between 12 and 15 seminars just for educators. And it's amazing. History teachers, civics teachers have literally sometimes come in not being able to explain the occupation. And I want to say this isn't you're not getting credit for coming to this seminar that we've run. So it's there's already self-filtering those who come. And still today, if you were to take pretty much any random civics teacher in Israel and say, you have a 45-minute class now, give a basic explanation as to how what's the difference between Israel Knesset in the 48 borders and Israeli military government in the West Bank, explain, maybe 1% of teachers can give a basic explanation.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like literally almost no one. And I think there's always this feeling of like they know, but they're not telling us. But it's like they also don't know and they're not telling us.
They don't know.
And I really felt like, okay, it's not enough to bring 18-year-olds to Hebron and to show them what's going on if they leave that day and they can't have a follow-up conversation with the people leading these programs, right? And they're not going to get it at home, and they're not going to get it anywhere else, and they're not going to Google it, you know?
So tell me a little bit about the Freedom School.
So Freedom School, Midresh Dol, is a project it's a project that basically works to educate the left, if you will. It's basically taking young people between the ages of like 18 and 30, depending on the program, and putting them through a process of education where they learn about the occupation and also learn about how to become activists, or how to become part of the movement to end the occupation.
Yeah, because there's a difference between saying I'm a leftist and actually understanding the occupation and knowing how to act against it.
Yes.
Those are very different things.
Two very, very different things. And I would argue that most leftists, I'm, not to be judgmental, I'm unimpressed.
Yeah.
Like if you are just saying you're on the left, but you're not doing anything tangible, then we're all just people in Tel Aviv drinking our coffee on Saturday mornings while settlers are beating up and shooting at Palestinians and taking over their land. It doesn't really matter who you vote for, right? Especially when at this point, like voting is almost irrelevant in terms of trying to end the occupation, meaning we need to build political power first. And building political power is going to happen through movement on the ground. And so we were 8 or 9 people who founded the Freedom School. And we basically were a group of organizers in our, late 20s, early 30s who had all gone through our own political awakening here in the country. I don't think any of us were convinced as children or as teens that we need to end the occupation. It was something that we all went through as a political process. And we wanted to create something that we didn't have available to us. When I was going through the realization of what we were doing, it was really hard for me emotionally, and I felt really lonely. And I think people who aren't here, I think, can't fully appreciate how lonely it is to see the reality and not be able to look away from it because you're standing by yourself for the most part. Mm-hmm. It's not very easy to know how to find people and who to talk about it with. And, I remember once before the war in 2014, but it was in 2014, it was Independence Day. So it was like April, the war broke out in June. But I already was working at Gisha. I was learning all this stuff about Gaza. I was already doing all this grassroots works with fellow citizens, like Jewish and Palestinian citizens of the country. And I remember that my partner and I at the time, now my ex, but like we went out to like celebrate Independence Day. And I remember being in Rothschild in Tel Aviv, which is this like huge, really nice street in Tel Aviv, very central. There was a lot of celebrations happening. And I remember sitting on the side of the curb and I started crying. And she was like, "Why are you crying?" And I was like, "I just feel so overwhelmed. Like, I don't know what I think about Zionism. I don't know what I think about the state. I don't know if we can do this without violence. And I don't feel okay with how much I've participated in it."
And then celebrating Independence Day.
And I remember even sitting there, everyone was writing something. We were all still using Facebook at the time. Everyone was writing like their statuses for Independence Day. And I didn't know if I should write a status or not, which I know seems so small in the grand scheme of things, but that's really where my emotions were of like, I don't know what to write. I don't want to say like, "Happy birthday, Israel," or like something really happy, but I feel afraid to not write something. And I just said to my partner at the time, like, I don't know what I think. I don't know how I feel about Zionism. I don't know how I feel about the state. And she goes, "We're going to get sushi. Like, why are you crying right now? Why are you bringing this to me?
Yeah, we're just eating sushi. What's like the
what
big deal?
What are you doing?" And I just remember thinking like how, overwhelmed I was in the conversation and in the process. And so years later, a lot of us who had felt this way said, we want to build something that gives people a feeling of knowledge, a feeling of community, a feeling of responsibility, not working from guilt. And we want to bring more activists into the movement, but we want the movement to be a place that's healthy enough to take them in, right? And I often tell people who join the Freedom School, I try and go and meet there's like a few groups a year, and I still try and go and meet every group. I'm still on the advisory committee. And when I do go and I talk to them, one of the first things I say is, we did not build this so that you can become more left. We did not build this so that you who started were voting for Yair Lapid and now you're voting for Hadash. That's not the point.
Like, we're not here to radicalize you.
The framing is not centering you, the participants. I'm not here to give you a good experience. We created this to strengthen the movement. And what the movement needs is young, healthy activists who have space to process their emotions, to process what they see, to do something with the guilt that we feel as Jewish Israelis, to learn to function from a place of responsibility so that we don't just come in, give it our all for 6 months and get burnt out like we tend to see over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Right? And we, I think, sat and built the Freedom School for like a year. And then we had the first group January of 2020 and have kept going ever since. And I do think, it's been a lot harder after October 7th, but I do think that the Freedom School is a good example of seeing actual movement building on the radical left, which is what we need to see. Because up until now, we tend to see this thing where movements will come up and they'll get really big, but they don't have all of the backbone to sustain them. And then they die down. Yeah. And then they build up again and they die down. And every time you're taking the knowledge, like instead of taking the experience and knowledge from the people that came before you, you started over.
That's very big part of the problem. People thinking that they have to start from scratch.
That you have to build the wheel, and you don't have to invent the wheel. We have the wheel. We've been doing it. And Palestinians have been doing it for decades. And we have partners who, who are leading the fight. But we need to be able to sustain ourselves as a collective. And I think one of my biggest goals for the coming years for the Israeli left, because we know we're going to be in this situation, it's the horrificness of the situation right now is probably not going to get better anytime soon. And so we also need to have a movement that's functioning. And I think that on one hand, we need to be able to both react in a time, like we need to be able to react quickly to things that are going on, but we also need to be able to initiate as a movement. And at the same time, there needs to be an option for every individual to be able to say, I need to step out for a second.
And to know that the movement will keep going.
And to know that the movement will keep functioning.
Yeah.
And that is something that if, the Freedom School and a few other things that I'm a part of, or even things that I'm not a part of, but are that are collectives that exist, manage to do that, then I think we're going to be in a much, much better place. And we're seeing the roots of it being built right now. For as hard as the reality is, I do think that that's getting better. I think one of the things I'm most proud about walking out of Breaking the Silence now is knowing that there is a system set up when people come on tours. If they learn and they were moved and they want to show up to Hebron as an activist, or they want to do protective presence in the South Hebron Hills, we have the systems in place to get them on board. Mm-hmm. Like that, I know, maybe people listening, like outside, it seems like small, but that is huge.
Yeah.
We didn't have that a decade ago. And I think, the Freedom School being able to be this collective that exists, that again, gives people a fuller package. Again, it's not about them. It's not about the people who are joining, even though I love them and I think they're brave and I think it's a hard thing to do. But what it's doing is it's strengthening the movement. And in doing so, it's strengthening all of us.
Yeah. Amazing. I'm a very big fan of the Freedom School, I have to say. But you also have things to say about the future, and not only as a reaction to the occupation and the violence, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that are on my mind right now is, what do we want? I said that when in 2014, I sat on the curb and I said, I don't know what I think about Zionism. I don't know if I'm a Zionist, I get that question all the time. Are you a Zionist? And I think it's a really boring question, because I'm not going to define myself through the lens of a movement I don't agree with. And I learned this a lot, I think, from Palestinians, especially those who I worked with at Tzedakah Re'ut, which is a a Jewish Palestinian citizen of Israel educational organization, one of the things that I learned about, I think, most from Palestinians there is we're not going to organize ourselves around a movement that doesn't include us, that doesn't see us, that doesn't involve us. Meaning, in the end of the day, when you call yourself an anti-Zionist, you're still centering Zionism. A lot of the questions I have right now is how do we transition to justice, and what does that justice look like, and what does that future look like? That's the movement what name does that movement have? There's no question that we need to break down systems of injustice here and systems of inequality and, the continuing Nakba and the occupation. There's no question that those things need to be broken down, but it's not enough. What do we want to build? And I am now spending time, and I hope the next projects that I'm going to do are seeking to answer, well, what do we want? I think it's very powerful. When I was, as a member of Breaking the Silence, we went with some of our Palestinian partners to South Africa. We learned about the apartheid. And first of all, it's very interesting that the Jewish and the Palestinian groups that went, we saw the whole situation very, not differently in the sense that one group thought it was apartheid and one didn't. We all knew it was apartheid, but the questions we were asking were very different because we were coming at it from different perspectives of where we are now, But one of the things that really stuck with me was sitting there with one of my friends who's Palestinian and partners, and we were going over the Freedom Charter from South Africa. And the Freedom Charter was saying, this is what will be, right? And the Freedom Charter wasn't like a group of 5 men sitting in a room, right? There was representatives, and it went out to all areas of South Africa. There were also but there were also white South Africans who contributed. And it came out and it said things like, I think we will be friends, one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. And it was a document of what do we want? Not just what is, right? Of course, also part of it was acting against the existing apartheid in the country, but a lot of it was also what do we actually want here? And that was an organizing structure that they had throughout South African apartheid, right? This is what we want. It's very basic, it's very simple, and we want to move forward with it.
And that was what got them accused of the treason.
Yes.
Into the treason trials, which is very interesting because saying what they did want instead of apartheid, right, as an alternative to apartheid, was the thing that most threatened the apartheid regime.
Exactly.
It's amazing.
Because it's an actual alternative.
Exactly.
And, I have obviously ideas of what I think are important here. I think that Jews and Palestinians both need to have access to every place between the river to the sea. I think that any sort of partition, there can be partitions in my opinion, right? I could see a next step being some sort of confederation, if you will, But in terms of access, there's no question that as long as there's not access to everyone between the river to the sea, to all areas, that the base of what we're living through right now will continue.
Yeah.
Right? So there's some things that I know that I want, but I'm one person, I'm one person who also, my family is from Jerusalem, but my great-grandfather studied in the yeshiva in Hebron, which today is in the West Bank. That Hebron is part of my story. It's part of my family. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to be an activist there and why I was so excited to lead tours there, because it's part of my story. Of course, I always am going to want access to it, but not instead of the people who live there, right?
Yeah.
So I have ideas of what I think makes sense, but I recognize I'm one person, and I'm not trying to lead, definitely not on my own. I want a charter. I want, and I realize what I'm saying. I realize how hard it is right now in the reality of 2024, where it's almost impossible for Palestinians and Israelis to think, what do we actually want here together? I think that's very, very, very hard to do right now. Especially, forget about if it's BDS or not BDS, normalization, not normalization. Israelis and Palestinians are in completely different universes right now. But even just starting with Jewish Israelis, What do we want? A lot of times we just knee-jerk react to what we say we want, which is basically kind of what we have, which is supremacy. Well, what's actually important to us if we don't have supremacy?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that that's one of the things that we're not answering. If we have equality, so what does that actually look like? Are there collective rights? Are we throwing collective rights out the window, right? Does everyone only have individual rights like the United States? Or do we have collective rights, but then we have to figure out a way that make them equal, right? Like we have to share power, which is by far the scariest thing for Israelis. Like, what's actually important to us?
Like, what do we want after the occupation is dismantled?
Yeah. What do we want? Yeah, we know we need to dismantle the occupation. But I also obviously believe, there's 7 million Israelis here today. There's 7 million Palestinians who live between the river to the sea. I think no one should be forced to go anywhere. Like, I don't believe in ethnic cleansing of anyone. Obviously, I think there'll be some movement maybe of like outposts and of this and of that. I'm not saying there won't be any change, but overwhelmingly, there's going to be here Jewish Israelis and there's going to be here Palestinians. Okay, we need to dismantle the inequality that comes from the occupation. We need to dismantle the inequality that comes from the Nakba. But what do we want after that?
Yeah, and anything after that is not just going to like fall into place naturally, harmoniously. You need to work for equality.
Build it.
Yeah,
we need to build it.
People have been living here with inequality and with oppression and violence for decades. They don't know what anything else looks like.
Right. And often a loss of privilege feels like a loss of rights.
Of course.
Right? Yeah. When you're living, I know I'm not saying anything that people don't know, but therefore, we do really have to, I think, challenge ourselves, but also it's an opportunity to actually ask, well, we're not doing well. Israeli society is not doing well.
Yeah. And to understand how to differentiate between loss of privilege and loss of rights. To differentiate between things that seem like so natural to us today.
Right. These are questions that I think we really have to be asking ourselves. And therefore, what I want to be working on now is thinking about how do we transition to justice, but how do we transition to justice actually? Not as just a thought, but as an actual plan with actual questions of what do we want here? Now, I realize most Israelis maybe won't come and try and be a part of this process right now because people are afraid, but I think there are people that are interested in doing it. And I also think that if given the opportunity, more Israelis, even on the Israeli right, will be interested in answering that question today than they would have a year and a half ago. I mean, I think there's like a real opportunity here. And I am tired of waiting for change to come, especially because the occupation is falling.
Yeah.
Right? Like Israel has lost control over the occupation and you can see it. It maintains a lot of power, but in a lot of ways has lost control.
Yeah.
Which is why, like Assad falls and Israel goes and takes over land in Syria. It's almost a knee-jerk reaction at this point and saying we have to hold all the control to ourselves. It's if once upon a time the zero sum genuinely was between Israelis and Palestinians, at this point it's expanded where it really is also Israel and
the Middle East.
Yeah. It's in some ways gone back to an Arab-Israeli conflict and not just Palestinian-Israeli, right? Yeah. And so what do we actually want here? And I think that that's the type of things that also groups like the Freedom School and people who are in it and the radical left we need to be taking upon ourselves. And the way that I often think about it is, if there's one thing that I think, for example, American Jews can contribute to the conversation, I think there's a lot that they can contribute to the conversation. But if there's one main thing, I think it's the importance of minority rights. Right? Like when you are not in power, you realize how important systems are of checks and balances and that allow you to have your collective freedoms, but doesn't take away the freedoms of other people, like doesn't take away the rights of other people. And we never think, right? Israelis love Trump, like because we love power. Right? And what we really need to be asking ourselves is, let's be honest, right now we're half Israeli Jews here and we're half Palestinians here. Unless we continue to engineer the population, Israeli Jews are going to be a minority between the river to the sea, which either means that we need to ethnically cleanse, right? Commit genocide, or like massive, like indefinite control over a majority when we're a minority.
Or we need to start thinking of how do we make sure that we have minority rights, because we're actually a minority.
Exactly.
We're going to be a minority very soon.
Right. And that's the other option, is to actually accept the reality that actually we're a minority here.
Yeah.
We're going to be a minority here. What's actually important to us? I think very few Israelis have ever asked themselves that question.
Because we're used to thinking of ourselves as the majority.
And even if we're not the majority, we're thinking of ourselves as those who have exclusive power.
Yeah.
But that's those two things are not sustainable. They're not working. They're completely immoral. And they're doing us badly as well.
Yeah.
And so, as a last thought, I think that we need to actually pause and think and create systems that demand us to ask, what do we actually want here? That does not involve control over another people, that does not involve engineering the population. I also don't want to engineer, like someone said to me the other day, oh, well, we can just get more Jews to move to Israel, right? Which I know Jews in the States because I grew up there. Most Jews don't want to move here. And if they do end up moving here, it's because anti-Semitism has become so violent and unbearable where they're living that they feel they have to, which is not an outcome we want for Jews in the world.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? Like, that's not a good option.
Yeah.
And so we have to ask ourselves, what do we actually want? And that's my goal for the, for the near future, is to be pushing thought processes and strategy and action that centers that question, at least on our side, so that when we come to the table and work with Palestinian partners and Palestinians in general, that we have a much clearer answer of what's actually important to us.
Definitely. Wow, Becca, you really are a strategist.
I'm working on it.
We need more of you, which is why I'm very happy that soon you are going to be a parent for the first time.
Yep.
And first of all, I want to say thank you so much for coming and talking about all this stuff. It's really important and interesting and moving, and I really appreciate all your work. Thank you. Second of all, I want to invite any one of the listeners that wants to listen to bonus episodes, some like extra juicy stuff that guests do not say in the quote unquote regular episodes. Anyone who's a Patreon knows that the good stuff, the real good stuff, is in Patreon. So check that out. There's a link in the show notes. I really appreciate your support, each and every one of you Patreons. Thank you so much. It really, really helps me keep this podcast going on. So check that out. We're going to have a bonus episode about you becoming a parent soon.
Yep.
So I'm really excited about that. Go and check the Patreon to listen to that. And that's it. Thank you.